Shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. Pokemon Scarlet and Pokemon Violet are coming out within the next 8 months, and with it comes a question on every Pokemon fan's mind. What will the new central generational gimmick be? Starting with Generation 6, each new Pokemon generation has come attached to a unique mechanic that seriously impacts gameplay. Generation 6 introduced the fan-favorite Mega Evolution. Generation 7 showed off flashy, ridiculous, overpowered attacks in the form of Z-moves. And Generation 8 brought about the universally beloved Dynamax mechanic. When thinking about what makes each new generation distinct, these central, game-changing features are the first thing that comes to mind. On top of these flashy variations to battles, though, each new generation brings about more subtle changes. While Pokemon is far from a balanced game, it's apparent that the developers do try their best to tune down some of the overperformers between generations, like how Smeargle was no longer allowed to use Dark Void moving from Generation 6 to Generation 7, or how Mega Kangaskhan and Mega Salamence were both nerfed going into Generation 7 after their dominant performances in Generation 6, or how the Pokemon Company has continued to beat Thundurus into the ground after what he did to Aaron Zheng. I'm appreciative that Game Freak does address a lot of the overpowered stuff, though it would be nice if they addressed all of it, or at least if they stopped adding new Pokemon that make Landorus look like Phanpy. One of the most integral parts of competitive Pokemon is the type chart. Since every Pokemon has either 1 or 2 types, each with many distinct relationships with the other types, a big part of the competitive balance is how strong the types are relative to one another. Over the years, Game Freak has tweaked the type chart significantly, whether by nerfing a type like Steel by removing resistances, or by buffing a type like Dark by giving it an added inherent effect. These more micro changes can have large implications on a type's viability. With regards to typing, the most drastic change Game Freak can make is to introduce a new type. This has enormous implications, as it shifts the entire landscape of the type chart. Because the effects are so dramatic, this has only happened twice in the entire history of Pokemon. In Generation 2, when Dark and Steel were added, and in Generation 6, when Fairy was added. Steel and Dark were added so early on that it's a bit difficult to make generalizations about how they showcase Game Freak's design philosophy. So let's instead take a closer look at Fairy. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could anyone watch this channel and not be subscribed? Well, believe it or not, only about 5% of my viewers are subscribed, and if we improve that number a bit, I really think we could get to 1 million subs. I hope you'll consider supporting me and the channel. In Generation 5, Dragon types reigned supreme. Dragon types naturally have very high base stats, and they all get access to the powerful move Draco Meteor, which at the time had 140 base power. Competitive Pokemon in Generation 5 also featured items called gems, which were sort of a precursor to Z-moves. They served as a consumable item that, when an attack of their type did damage, would make it 50% stronger. Dragon Pokemon in particular made excellent use of these gems, as they already had the requisite stats and high base power move to do enormous damage. Latios, Hydreigon, Salamence, and Garchomp were all great Pokemon during Generation 5, and a lot of the metagame centered around beating them. In 2011, Hydreigon won the World Championships, and Haxorus finished second. In 2012, Hydreigon and Garchomp were both on the winning team, and aside from my team, which finished second, every team from 3rd to 8th had at least one Dragon type. In 2013, a Dragon type once again won the World Championships, with over half of the teams using a Dragon type in the top 8. To give you some idea of the raw power Dragon types had, let's take a look at Latios. Every Pokemon in the format wanted to survive Latios Dragon Gem Draco Meteor. For example, super bulky and slow Habenberry Garchomp was something I personally won nationals with that year. I think the best example of how focused people were on Latios is to look at Thundurus EV spreads. In 2012, Thundurus were normally slow and bulky, with a focus on using Thunder Wave, Taunt, and Swagger to disrupt enemy teams. Nearly every Thundurus made surviving Latios' boosted Draco Meteor a priority. What made Dragon so difficult to deal with from a typing perspective was the fact that the only type that resisted it was Steel. Ordinarily, one of the best tools to deal with powerful meta-defining attacks is to use Pokemon that resist or are immune to them. But that just wasn't possible in this case unless you wanted to run multiple bulky Steel Pokemon. These moves were also so strong that bulky steel Pokemon could still expect to lose at least half of their health switching into Dragon Gem Draco Meteor. The final nail in the coffin is that for many dragon types like Garchomp, Salamence, and Hydreigon, they had access to coverage moves like Earthquake, Earth Power, or Flamethrower that could hit most steel Pokemon for super effective damage. The other option you would normally have is to just knock out these Pokemon before they were able to use their huge attacks, but this was almost impossible to consistently do. Not only do dragon types have really good base stats across the board, they also have tons of useful resistances, and their only weaknesses at the time were to Ice, one of the worst types in the game, and other dragon types, which didn't solve the issue, obviously. This put Game Freak in a really tricky spot. There was always the option of taking away some of Dragon's resistances or giving Dragon more weaknesses, but there's no guarantee that wouldn't cause more problems down the road by making an existing type overpowered. What Game Freak did instead was to simply introduce a new type, Fairy, whose primary goal was to weaken the Dragon type. Fairy was given an immunity to Dragon moves, and the ability to deal super effective damage to them in return. Now, from a bird's eye view, Game Freak actually succeeded in their mission. With the introduction of a new type, Dragon was no longer the most broken type in the game. The bad news was that the most broken type in the game was now Fairy. So yeah, one step forward, two steps back. Fairy was given the ability to hit 3 types for super effective, 3 types for not very effective damage, 3 resistances, 2 weaknesses, and an immunity. It was also given some very powerful no drawback attacks like Play Rough and Moonblast. What makes Fairy so powerful is, in my opinion, twofold. First, it only has 2 weaknesses, and both of those weaknesses are to types that typically focus on defenses rather than offenses. Poison in particular is an especially bad type. Steel is also a type known mainly for its defensive attributes. There are many Steel-type Pokemon who don't always run a Steel-type move. Second, Fairy is an amazing offensive type. Even though it only hits 3 types for super effective damage, it hits a majority of the type chart for neutral damage, which is a big deal when you have strong Pokemon with big moves. In fact, the best Pokemon ever since Fairy was introduced has been a Fairy type, with Xerneas reigning supreme in Generation 6 and 7, and Zacian in Generation 8. If all Fairy types were like Wigglytuff, we wouldn't have a problem, but alas, Sword Dog. The conditions now, with Fairy being overpowered, are extremely similar to what they were like when Dragon was overtuned, leading to the introduction of the Fairy type. We have a broken type that clearly stands above the rest, and a new generation coming out soon. We know that this new generation is going to be a big step from the existing franchise, with the leap to making Pokemon an open world game, which to me seems like the perfect opportunity to also introduce a new type. And so, I believe there's no better time to introduce the Sound type. Now, at this point, I know what you're thinking. Wow, Wolf, you know so much about Pokemon. Is there any way you could share some of that knowledge with me? Well, good viewer, I am pleased to announce a project my friends and I have been working on since October of 2020. Throughout all of my time playing VGC, one simple question has stumped me the most. How do I play VGC? Although it is an easy question to ask, this is actually a really difficult question to answer. My friends Aaron Zhang, Aaron Trailer, Marisa, and I set out to answer this question. We set out to make the ultimate guide to competitive Pokemon, a one-stop shop that will be relevant forever. This was a pretty massive undertaking. I myself wrote over 50,000 words over the course of the last year and a half, and I was just one of many contributors to the whole project. I think this guide will be useful to you no matter your skill level. If you're totally new to competitive play, you can check out our introduction section, which has introductions for lots of different backgrounds in Pokemon. If you've played online but are considering going to a live event, you can learn what to expect from our circuit section. And if you already know a bit about competitive Pokemon, I'm sure you'll find things that are helpful to you in both the team building and battling sections, whether you're just starting out or already a pro. VGC Guide is and always will be free. But if you find the site useful and want to and are able to support us, you can find our Ko-Fi link on the site. We'll aim to add more articles over time, as well as work on getting the site translated into other languages. And obviously, we'll do a big update for Generation 9 as well. Honestly, this was an enormous undertaking, so I hope you find it useful. Anyway, back to the video. Why Sound specifically as a new type? There's lots of new potential types: Plasma type, Evil type, Bagel type. Why choose Sound? The answer to me is simple. Sound actually already exists in the Pokemon games, and it's used as a unique property that sets it apart from other moves. First, they have special interaction with certain abilities. Soundproof blocks all damage from sound-based moves. Liquid Voice turns all sound-based moves to water type, and Punk Rock gives a 30% damage boost to sound-based moves. They can also be shut down by a Pokemon getting hit with Throat Chop, and they'll activate the item Throat Spray if the holder uses a sound type move. These are all mostly edge cases, and they don't come up very often. But there is one universal property of sound-based moves that makes them powerful in competitive Pokemon. A sound-based move will ignore a Pokemon that has set up a substitute. This is true of damaging moves like Boom Burst, as well as status moves like Parting Shot. Substitute nearly always has usage in competitive Pokemon, and the ability to ignore it and attack the user directly is a big benefit of using one of these moves. So, sound-type moves already exist in the game, and there are existing Pokemon with sound-based abilities that are clear beneficiaries of the type. Before we talk about how I would design this type, I'm curious what you all think. How would you tackle designing the sound type? From my perspective, I care a lot more about Pokemon types being somewhat competitively balanced than about types making perfect thematic sense. For that reason, I'm going to design this type with competitive Pokemon in mind specifically. And I just want to say that if you don't like this approach, that's totally okay. I absolutely respect people who love Pokemon for the lore and theme, but for me, I care most about competitive. My goal with the sound type is to bring down the types that are currently overperforming and bring up some of the weaker types. We have 4 levers that we can play with here when designing our new type. Its weaknesses and resistances defensively, and the types it hits for super effective and not very effective damage offensively. The end goal is to make a type that is somewhere in the upper B tier, lower A tier, hoping to avoid the mistakes that were made when Fairy was introduced. First, the weaknesses. This is a great opportunity to boost up the types towards the bottom of the barrel when it comes to the current metagame. All in all, I would give the sound type 4 weaknesses. First, Bug. Bug is the single worst type in the game, and the main thing keeping it down is its abysmal offensive coverage. So many types resist Bug, and the few types it does hit for super effective damage aren't typically considered especially strong. To make matters worse, many of the Pokemon that are common and have a single type weak to Bug have their other type resist it. Pokemon like Incineroar, Venusaur, and Whimsicott all have one type weak to Bug, but they also have a secondary type that resists it, resulting in a neutral relationship. If there were a prominent type in the metagame that was weak to Bug, it would do a lot for Bug Pokemon, who are in sore need of help. At the moment, the Bug Pokemon with the highest usage is Shedinja, a gimmicky Pokemon who still doesn't even crack 4% on the usage stats. The next type I would make sound weak to is Poison. Poison's identity is as a defensive type, and although Fairy being weak to Poison did a lot for the type, it wasn't enough. Letting Poison hit another type for super effective damage would hopefully allow it to be a slightly more balanced type than it currently is. Third, Rock. Rock isn't a bad type per se, but it does have a number of things that hold it back. In the current format, Rock is really struggling. The highest performing Rock type right now has less than 1% usage, being Colossal. Rock already hits 4 types for super effective damage, but 2 of those are Bug and Ice, the 2 worst types in the game. Giving Rock another offensive tool would hopefully give it the little bump it needs to keep up with the other types. Lastly, Psychic. My main issue with Psychic is that I feel like it kind of exists off on its own with Ghost and Dark, and although it does have some interaction with the other types, to me, it's always felt like Psychic, Ghost, and Dark are kinda off doing their own thing. By giving Psychic the ability to hit another type, I would hope to both bring it closer to the rest of the type chart and give it a bit more separation from the Ghost type. Next up, Resistances. With Resistances, we're going to look to bring down some of the types at the top that are a bit too strong. Of course, the first resistance we're going to want is to Fairy. We've already talked a bit about how and why Fairy is so powerful, and a big part of that is the limited types that resist it. We want our new type to be relevant. Adding a new type but having it suck doesn't do any good. And honestly, a positive matchup against Fairy goes a long way. With a 4th type that resists Fairy in the metagame, hopefully some of the balance would be restored to the type chart. Our next resistance is Water. Water is a really solid, well-balanced type. In my typing tier list video, I have it in the S tier. It only has 2 weaknesses, a number of useful resistances, and totally solid offensive coverage. Water also has been at times an especially terrifying offensive type, because rain boosts the power of extremely strong attacks like Water Spout, Hydro Pump, Hydro Vortex, and Max Geyser. I think giving Sound a water resistance would be a healthy change, and hopefully give players more tools to deal with powerful, rain-boosted attacks. Our third resistance is to Steel. Steel is the single best defensive type in the game, but offensively, it's actually pretty decent now because of how important being able to hit fairy types is. What ends up happening is that Steel becomes not only the single best defensive type in the game by a long shot, it also has a very respectable offensive spread. In my opinion, it shouldn't be able to have both, so I'm giving Sound a Steel resistance to nudge Steel back towards its identity as a defensive type. Our final resistance is to Flying. Flying is a solid, middle-of-the-pack type, but in part because of the strength of Max Airstream, it's felt a little bit too strong during Generation 8. Some of this definitely has to do with how good Dynamax is, but I think it also exposed the fact that Flying is a really hard type for many Pokemon to deal with. I don't want to bring Flying down too much, but I do think that bringing down the power level of Flying's offenses just a little bit would lead to a better experience overall. We've covered the defensive relationships of our new type, so now it's time for the offensive ones. First, let's talk about the types Sound should be able to hit for super effective damage. First, Fairy. Fairy is too strong as a whole, and on top of it being a great offensive type, it's also a phenomenal defensive one. Adding another weakness to Fairy would help bring it down to a type with defined strengths and weaknesses, rather than a type that's generally strong against everything. Next, Steel. Steel has 10 resistances and an immunity on its own, without even considering a second type. In my opinion, that's too many, and Steel is being greedy, so I'm adding a weakness to give more Pokemon tools to actually damage Steel types. Finally, Water. Water only has 2 weaknesses, which is very few, especially given how powerful of a type it is. Adding a third weakness would probably drop Water from the S tier to the A tier, keeping it viable while bringing it down just a little bit. And finally, the types that Sound would hit for not very effective damage. First, Bug. We've talked about how bad Bug is, and I think giving it another resistance would give Bug Pokemon at least a little bit more to work with. Second, Ice. Ice is the second worst type in the game, and it's because it only resists itself. And ideally, a resistance to a type that is somewhat common might let Ice types at least be playable under the right conditions. Third, Rock. We've talked a bit about Rock already, so you know I think it needs some help. Giving Rock another resistance would hopefully allow it a bit more survivability, as at the moment, Rock types really struggle due to their weaknesses to common types. Rock also gets a secondary benefit, as its weaknesses to Water and Steel become less common due to Sound's positive matchup against those types. Finally, Psychic. Psychic only has 2 resistances, which can make the type difficult to use. Adding a third resistance allows Psychic to perform better overall, and hopefully allows Psychic types to be less reliant on their dual type to really shine. With the outline of our type done, it's time to start filling in the details. What's great about Sound is that since we already have Sound-based moves, we already have an idea of what attacks the type would end up getting. On the special side, I think Sound already has a number of useful moves in place. Hyper Voice for consistent spread damage, Bug Buzz for a single target stab, and Boom Burst for a very powerful move that also threatens your partner. If Game Freak does add Sound as a type in Generation 9, they'll need to make sure they have a few consistent physical attacks as well. Alright, enough with the nerdy stuff. Now let's talk about the fun part. One of the coolest parts of Generation 6 to me was how a bunch of old Pokemon got retyped with Fairy's introduction. Clefairy, Azumarill, Mawile, Togekiss, the list goes on. Giving these old Pokemon Fairy types skyrocketed their viability, and every Pokemon I just named actually would go on to win a regional, in part thanks to their new type. With Sound type, it would be a great opportunity to go back through and retype some classic Pokemon. We're going to follow the same rules Game Freak did when adding this type, which means we can give the Sound type to either a Pokemon with only one existing type as a secondary type, or we can replace the normal type on a Pokemon with 2 types already. Unfortunately, this means Pokemon like Noivern and Toxtricity will not be beneficiaries of the Sound type in this experiment. Our first beneficiary of our new type is Wigglytuff, serving as a Fairy and Sound type Pokemon. Now, Wigglytuff isn't a good Pokemon, but it did win a regional back in 2014 because of how strong Fairy was, and due to its ability competitive, which is also very strong. With Fairy and Sound typing, Wigglytuff would have the ability to hit other Fairy and Steel types, as well as the Pokemon Fairy normally does well against. It still wouldn't be a great Pokemon, but it would at least be a little bit better. Next up is Exploud. This Pokemon is basically a walking boombox, so it should come as no surprise that it gets the Sound type. Exploud has great move coverage, but mediocre stats. It would likely still be not great with the Sound type, but it would have a bit more identity at least than it does at present. In the right format, it might even be good, due to its access to Boom Burst and soundproof ability. Chimecho is a personal favorite Pokemon of mine, but boy does it stink. There are so many Psychic Pokemon with Levitate, and Chimecho really doesn't do anything better than any of them. It isn't bulkier than Cresselia or Uxie, and it doesn't have the offensive capabilities of Azelf. With a Sound dual type, Chimecho would at least have a niche it could fill due to its relatively solid defensive typing, good ability, and decent utility moves. Now, we can't talk about Sound without talking about Kricketune. Kricketune is an amazing Pokemon, not because it's good competitively, but because it's funny.
Hi, boy.
It would still be bad, even if we gave it the Sound type, but maybe people would use it more, which is a big net positive, because then we'd get to hear the cry more. Last but not least, we have Chatot. At present, Chatot is normal and flying type, but with this change, would end up being Sound and flying instead. There are a fair few normal and flying type Pokemon already, so this change would at least let Chatot have something of a unique identity compared to all the other regular birds. Just like the other Pokemon I mentioned, it still most likely would not be very good. And there you have it. This is more or less a complete look at how I would design the Sound type. Squarespace gives people a powerful and beautiful online platform from which to create your website. Connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated, members-only content. Manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights, all on one easy-to-use platform. Create a community on your Squarespace website with a fully integrated commenting system that supports threaded comments, replies, and likes. Use their powerful blogging tools to categorize, share, and schedule your posts too. Extend Squarespace's already powerful e-commerce capabilities with Squarespace extensions. These new third-party tools can help you manage inventory, promote products, streamline bookkeeping, reconcile and file sales tax, and ship items across the globe. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/wolfeyvgc to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments, let me know. Thank you for watching.